Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone joining us today. On behalf of USAID and ResilienceLinks, I welcome you to our Theme Month webinar on Market Systems Resilience in Practice, Lessons Learned and Next Steps. I'm Jamie Charles with ResilienceLinks. Before we begin, let me orient you to the Zoom platform. On the bottom of the screen, you'll see most of your controls. First, please use the chat to introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining us from. To ask questions throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A button. We are recording this webinar and will email you the post-event resources shortly following the event. You can also find the resources on ResilienceLinks.org. Next slide, please. Let's briefly look at today's agenda. After some opening remarks, we will hear brief presentations from our speakers. Then we will open the floor to take questions from the audience and hear closing remarks from our Theme Month co-host, Dan Hudner, Senior Researcher for Markets and Resilience at Mercy Corps. Next slide, please. Thank you for your attendance, and I will now pass it to our co-host, Barka Peter Kweji, Resilience Advisor for Feed the Future's Nigeria Rural Resilience Activity.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for our participants joining us today. My name is Barka Kweji. I work for the Feed the Future Nigeria Rural Resilience Activity as Resilience Advisor. We are glad to have you join us today for this webinar with ResilienceLinks. In a world where we struggle with escalating shocks and stressors ranging from climate shocks, conflict shocks, social shocks, health shocks, building a resilient market that supports resilient households becomes imperative. It becomes imperative to be able to achieve large-scale, sustainable, and effective economic transformation and stability. In today's webinar series, we have lined up several speakers with diverse and relevant expertise who will be sharing evidences, lessons from their wealth of experience, and of course, what next for market system resilience and market system development. But at this juncture, please permit me to briefly introduce these speakers. Kristen Planik is the Market Systems Team Lead in USAID Bureau for Resilience, Environment and Food Security, where she has been working to advance and facilitate market system across the entire Feed the Future portfolio. She also manages the Feed the Future Market Systems partnership activity, as well as the Climate Finance and Development Accelerator activity. She brings to this conversation more than 20 years experience in international development, and she has served as volunteer with Peace Corps in Guinea, and she has earned an MBA with distinction from Cornell University in the States. Next is Maggie Brand. Maggie Brand is the initiator and director of Vikara Institute. Vikara Institute is an organization that specializes in applying system lens in addressing development challenges across the world. Maggie has worked across 20 different countries and across broad spectrum of areas, including market system resilience, microfinance, entrepreneurship development, just to name a few. Maggie has developed curriculum and tools, which has been translated into 15 languages and is currently being used in over 35 countries across the world. Michael Field is a system thinking specialist with Vikara Institute, and is bringing into this conversation over 30 years experience in applying system thinking approaches across different regions in the world, across a broad spectrum of areas, including housing, health, and market system. Mike Field has played a key role in improving practices in the field of applied system thinking and approaches to international development, both for donors and implementing partners. Next is William Barrow. William Barrow is the Chief of Party for the Feed the Future Resilience in Pastoralist activity, which is being implemented in Ethiopia. It's an activity that aims to enhance resilience of households in pastoral lone areas of Ethiopia. William brings more than 17 years experience, professional experience to this conversation, working across different regions of the world, different continents, and across a broad range of areas, including design and implementation of market system resilience activity, peace building, conflict sensitivity, and governance intervention. The next is John Rajkara. John Rajkara is the Chief of Party for the USAID Feed the Future Nigeria Rural Resilience Activity. John leads a strong and resilient team of people working in Northeast Nigeria on an intervention that aims to establish lasting solution to chronic vulnerability and poverty by creating and strengthening economic opportunities in Northeast Nigeria, strengthening the market system so that people can have meaningful choices. John Rajkara brings over 14 years experience working in East and West Africa to this conversation across a broad spectrum of areas, including markets, commodities, services, agriculture, both in urban and rural setting. At this juncture, I have the honor to pass it on to Christian to deliver the opening remark and the introduction. Thank you, Anova.
Thanks so much, Barka. So from the beginning, USAID defined resilience as the ability of people, households, communities, countries, and systems to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and it facilitates inclusive growth. So initially, programming focused on the people and households, and we certainly learned a lot in that first generation of resilience activities. Then at some point, I was asked about market systems resilience. We realized that while we had a very established market systems portfolio addressing competitiveness and inclusion, the resilience piece was uncharted territory. Yet I feel strongly that the market systems community, given its strength and depth, was the perfect place to start to figure out what systems resilience programming could mean. So let's talk about systems for resilience and resilient systems. Very important concept. So in times of shock and stress, people and households depend on local systems to mitigate impact and speed recovery. One of these critical systems is the market system. There is evidence that households connected to functioning markets have better resilience. I'm sure that's no surprise to anyone. If something bad happens, access to certain goods and services can support coping and recovery, not to diminish the ability to mitigate the risk of that bad thing in the first place. Yet what happens if the market fails in a big way? I'm thinking about the damage done to households when Ebola shut down trade in West Africa, or when workplaces closed during the COVID-19 pandemic, or in any of the many places experiencing conflict. Can households be resilient if the markets they depend on are not? Perhaps for a time with really excellent government service provision, but eventually, I don't think so. So while market systems are essential for household resilience, market systems themselves must also be resilient to shocks and stresses. It's important to examine and analyze market system functions against probable risks to inform our programming. So systems resilience can be understood as the ability of a system to respond to disturbance in a way that allows consistency and sustainability, or that leads to improvement in the system's functioning. Now, I hope you're still with me because I want to be really nuanced here. Market systems are naturally incredibly resilient. This is how 80% of our humanitarian response can use market-based delivery mechanisms rather than actual food aid. But the market systems resilience that we're talking about here is really about that consistency and sustainability, how to avoid the dynamics that bad actors can manipulate, especially in times of shock or stress. How to get that quality of resilience that improves the system's functioning for everyone. The end goal of resilience for USAID is human well-being. That always brings us back to the people and the households in the end. So how do we nudge a market system's behaviors to be more resilient, such that its functioning provides that consistent, sustainable improvement that delivers inclusive development benefits? So I love the focus of today's discussion, market systems resilience in practice. It's very exciting to be in a place where market systems resilience isn't just an idea, but something that dozens of programs are out there doing across a range of contexts, and to see how considering systems for resilience and resilient systems has a tangible impact on programmatic decisions. It's amazing how what seems like a good intervention idea can shift when the market systems questions aren't all about growth and profit drivers, but bring risk into the conversation. So with that, I'll pass the floor to Mike and Marky.
Thank you, Kristen. And I'm Margie Brand with the Vicara Institute. And I think very importantly from our side is we're realizing how market systems resilience is actually acting as a bit of a bedrock to a lot of our market systems development work. So it's almost the beginning space for us to approach our market systems development work. And market systems resilience is also becoming such an important way for us to understand households and impact at household level and community level, probably more so than we realized kind of starting out in the market systems resilience pathway. We wanted to start by just sharing a few examples of some key resources, because this area of experience is growing so quickly globally. And if we look at the slide, which shows you, one of the things we did was a state of the field map supported through USAID's Market Systems and Partnership mechanism, where we started looking at what are programs that are actually doing market systems resilience type work globally. And that's something that will be updated and actually provides a lot of information and connections to what studies have these programs done, where have they started, what lessons they've learned, who contact people are, etc. Just this is a growing wealth of information to draw from. Next, we'll look at there's some briefs that have been prepared. This is just an example. These are available on the Market Links, the ResilienceLinks side, on AgriLinks, on various platforms. And, talking about demystifying market systems resilience, and another one on, using a market systems resilience lens to support household resilience, and how do we understand the connection between the bigger market systems and then the household level resilience. Next, we'll look at a resource that is a cartoon learning series around market systems resilience, and looks at market systems resilience and household resilience. How do we analyze this space? How do we understand what it's about, to really demystify a lot of the thinking around market systems resilience down to the sort of frontline field workers, even on programs, etc. And a lot of these type of, even the cartoons, the briefs, are built off the market systems resilience framework that we also developed with USAID, and has been tested and rolled out in various places. Just to mention these, this cartoon learning series is also available in French and Spanish, and in some places in Portuguese and in Haitian Creole as well. The next set of resources that I'll mention is there's actually a community of practice, and it's a global community of practice of practitioners that are heavily involved in market systems resilience, and that is open for others to join as well. So an active learning space and sharing space that has really grown our wealth of experience. But I wanted to turn to the next piece, which is to look a little bit at some very practical examples of what has come out of some of the studies that have been done in this area by the Vicara Institute. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start by looking a little bit at a study which we did in Ethiopia. And for this, I'm going to call on my colleague Mike Field to just share some learning that has come from the space. And we learned so many interesting things. There's sort of a wealth of information around resilience, not only in businesses but communities and down to household levels. I mean, we came across associations that had lost all of the 48,000 seedlings that they'd planted the previous year because of poor seed quality. And they'd invested heavily in 2 rounds of cultivation, spent a lot on seedling purchases and poly bags. And they said at the end, we lost all our money and time, and more importantly, our morale and energy to continue our business. It's something that the whole community was involved in. And we learned about the cultural system called the Afeni system, which is used for dispute resolution in some parts of Ethiopia, where if there is a local dispute happening in the market in a buying or selling relationship, the person will turn to someone right next to them who's now heard the complaint, and that person will become de facto the mediator. And if that person can't help the buyer or seller agree, then the price is simply split between the two instances that is being or the price or the quantity or whatever it might be that is under contention. And this is a culture that's very strong in the community level and doesn't discriminate by gender or age, and helps some of that dispute resolution and mediation function that is very important in kind of the resilience in a market system space. And we learned a lot about religious practices such as fasting having such a significant impact on the milk market and milk production for an income at household level. But Mike, maybe I can turn to you for a moment and just talk about, what were some of the interesting findings for us in understanding resilience from this extensive study that was done?
Thanks, Margie, and thanks to everybody who joined today. What I thought was really fascinating about the Ethiopia study is that it highlighted the importance of context-specific understanding. We were joking when we were in the middle of doing this study. It was like doing 5 different countries or 6 different countries in the varied ways that communities did coping. For example, if you looked at some of the communities in Jima, they were very focused on managing their risks through their kind of income and wealth that they've generated, mostly through the production of coffee. At the same time, in other parts, maybe the lowlands and pastoralist areas, they used lots of social coping mechanisms, as well as their livestock managed as a saving structure, as well as an income generating structure, which is also very interesting and very key, that I think we'll talk more about. That was also what was interesting about that is the way they engaged market was very different than the way the Jima communities engaged markets. That meant that for any project engaging in the communities in the pastoralist areas, really had to understand the kind of coping strategies of the community to understand how to engage the markets in a way to help markets engage the communities in a way that added to resilience for both the market system and the communities there. Where in Jima, it was very interesting how they, when stresses came out, including some of the issues you mentioned around seedlings, they used what we would think of as more commercial strategies to try and figure out how to do it, like look for new markets or look for new suppliers or look for better quality control of the suppliers, which was substantially different than some of the other community mechanisms that we saw in other parts of Ethiopia.
Let's look at another study, and we start comparing results here. We did another study in Haiti, and when we look at the Haiti study, some really interesting areas around if there's no feed meal available, there are the study was focused on livestock, and where there's no equipment to be able to heal some livestock if they get injured. So then it takes maybe 6 to 8 weeks to keep livestock and trying to get them back into the normal stage because they just don't have the equipment. And I think there's a lot of examples of people taking on diverse sort of coping mechanisms, and then we're seeing things where there's a very big difference between are people using or keeping livestock in order to generate income, or they're using it as something almost as a savings mechanism. And one of the things we saw there was goats were kept but only sold if there was something significant, for example, paying for school fees or a house that needed repair, that goats would only be sold in those cases. It wasn't a constant income source, but more of something that was a savings mechanism in order to increase resilience. Mike, any takeaways from your side in terms of the study from when you were in Haiti?
Yeah, a couple of things that I thought were really fascinating about Haiti that were different, substantially different than Ethiopia. The communities were, and more the households were very reliant on the market, but not the market to generate income, but the market to engage when they needed cash for when shocks and stresses hit. Haiti itself has been under quite a long set of shocks and varied shocks and stresses. And this most recent one was the political instability, primarily in Port-au-Prince. Also highlighted some very interesting things, in particular, something that Kristen pointed out. They were very reliant, or there was an increasing reliance on households to use poultry as a kind of cash generator. We were joking they were like the ATM in their strategy. So they would essentially turn over cash and chicken production fairly quickly. But it was based on high quality day-old chicks being sold. But with the problems in Port-au-Prince, the larger businesses that were doing day-old chick production essentially went out of business, or they left the Haiti market. And that resulted in this one coping mechanism, which was poultry production, to kind of wither in the communities or the households, forcing the communities and households to kind of rely on different types of mechanisms, again, primarily market-based, which meant they started to sell goats a little bit faster, or they started to think about whether there was more cash they could get from milk from the cows or the goats. So it's a very interesting set of challenges that are very context dependent to Haiti and Haiti's history and culture, that when they project that we're working with is developing their strategy to engage in market development, MSD kind of approaches, they had to kind of understand how those communities were managing and engaging markets in order to understand what they would be asking them to do if they wanted to increase productivity or invest in certain types of vaccines or other things for animals, that there's a trade-off potentially involved in that for those communities or those households.
Thank you, Mike. I mean, there was another study we did in Kenya, which was a longer study over a 2-year process and looked at certain markets. And we actually compared sort of livestock and mango systems and try to understand resilience in both of those. A lot of interesting findings there. Another study in Nepal, which I think there was a significant amount of findings even related to migration and how migration impacted, also in terms of social safety nets and how the government and what kind of government services and other social safety nets are really critical to be in place to understand resilience. And a last study that I'll mention is the study in the Ukraine, which is an ongoing study looking at understanding resilience in emergency contexts and how to rebuild better. And that's something that we've been involved with pre the crisis in the Ukraine, understanding what was happening in the market system, and then obviously following on with the market piece. So I know that if anyone's interested in any of those areas of finding out more, and particularly from Mike's insights in those studies, please do put that in the Q&A. So then I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Margie, and hi, everyone. I'm William. I'm the Chief of Party for Mercy Corps' Ripa North activity in the lowlands of Ethiopia, where I am now. I'm in Jijiga in the Somali region of Ethiopia. And I thought what I'd do today is give an overview of how we approach resilience on Ripa North, focusing on how the market systems development approach is at the heart of that and how we've layered market systems resilience onto that. Next slide, please. So our theory of change, and this is kind of reinforcing what Kristin presented at the beginning, our theory of change is that if our target households have access to this array of different types of resilience enhancing information, products, services, and market opportunities, and if those services themselves are resilient and gender sensitive, then we believe that households will be more resilient to shocks and they'll achieve our overall goal of sustainable improvements in food security and incomes. Next slide, please. So the top part of our theory of change is really our standard market systems development approach, in which we're trying to build out private sector services, things like animal health, access to livestock buyers, financial services. But it also encompasses recognizing that some of these services are provided by government. It also encompasses government system strengthening, things like conflict resolution mechanisms and community nutrition services. Next slide, please. So one example, particularly important kind of resilience enhancing service in our areas is, of course, animal health. And we see that in the good times, access to animal health increases productivity of herds and therefore incomes in terms of sales of animals and also sales of milk. And in the bad times, it reduces herd losses during droughts or disease outbreaks when animals are weakened. And so I won't go into detail in this. The learning brief that you can see there was the one that was part of the ResilienceLinks newsletter, and we can put the link in the chat as well. But for us, really, the big focus of this intervention was working out how to find a solution of last mile services that are market-based. Because when it comes to animal health in the lowlands of Ethiopia, this has always been the really big shortcoming that many agencies, including Mercy Corps in the past, have faced challenges with. And then just in terms of household level impact, just to highlight the big increase in access to animal health services from households, and the fact that our randomized control trial found that in repo areas, 56% of households use modern vet services, whereas in non-repo areas, it was only 35%. And I'd just also like to point out that, what we aren't able to do is highlight the impact of this particular intervention on things like household income, and definitely not on resilience. It's difficult to isolate it. Basically, there are so many factors that we can't look at just the impact of this intervention on those outcomes. Next slide, please. So we also recognize, like Kristen highlighted, is that these resilience and enhancing services, they're not that useful if they cease to function themselves during shocks. And so this middle piece of our theory of change is focused on market systems resilience and also gender. We're not going to talk about that today. And we distinguish between these two aspects of market systems resilience. One is business continuity. Are the services able to continue during shocks? And the second is, are the business services able to respond to shocks, so adapt their business practices and services to better serve the needs of customers and households? Next slide, please. So what we wanted to do was really find a very practical way of applying market systems resilience in order to really design MSR systems interventions right from the beginning. And so the approach that we took, we asked ourselves these questions you can see here, and we use a series of tools to kind of document that and give us and link us to the next set of questions. So the starting point was simply, what shocks impact livestock supply chains in the lowlands of Ethiopia? And then secondly, looking in a lot of detail at how each shock impacts the system and also individual actors within that system. And then we use that information to look ahead and say, okay, so how can we build system structures and capacities that can withstand shocks? And also, how can we build the individual capacities of actors so they're able to withstand shocks and also respond to shocks? And by the way, this is also, this intervention on livestock supply chain, this is another learning brief, and we'll also post that in the chat. Next slide, please. So maybe to go in a bit of more detail here to summarize our approach, although this is also going to be quite high level. But basically our MSR lens allowed us to really analyze the risk in this livestock supply chain, even during normal times. And what we found really was the risk was almost entirely borne by actors at the regional level, in particular these regional traders who we call our partners who are regional livestock traders, these goat aggregation enterprises, and also livestock producers. And the MSR lens also enabled us to look at what happens during the dry season and droughts in the lowlands and understand why and how the system breaks down. And for example, what we saw was that, during the dry season and also droughts, the body condition of animals weakens. So for these regional traders or GAEs, it's not profitable for them to actually fatten the animals to prepare them for sale. And for the producers, they have to kind of walk quite long distances to their markets. And they don't know if they're going to find buyers because the buyers don't want to fatten them. And also the animals are weak, so they don't really want to take the risk of walking them long distances. So what we saw was that the whole system breaks down. And then this understanding allowed us then to design interventions to address these specific problems that we were seeing in this particular value chain or system. And our solution was all around vertical integration, which is about actors at each level investing in their supply chain, particularly investing in trust-based relationships. So this was large buyers located near to the capital, investing in agents at local level, regional level, who are able to do on-the-spot checks, who are able to reject animals and make payments at the point of sale. And it's also about these regional traders. The big focus was them investing in last mile mini collector networks. So these are kind of aggregators, mini collectors who are located in bush markets close to the livestock producers, or in some cases they're located even in the villages themselves. And the impact of this that we've seen is that livestock producers are able to sell animals closer to their home, and that increases their bargaining power. It enables them to make more market-based decisions because they can know the price and decide whether to sell or not before they've walked the animals long distances. And it enables flows of information and embedded services through the system. And what we saw was this large impacts in sales. You can see here 193%. That was the average increase in numbers of livestock purchased by these GAEs from households, and a very significant value in terms of US dollar purchases every quarter. And we saw changes in behavior at household level. For example, producers spending more time fattening animals before sales, and also new practices by these market actors like regional traders. A lot of them have now started planting and storing fodder to support business continuity during these dry seasons. Next slide, please. So this graph I find really interesting. So as you might know, Ethiopia recently suffered its worst drought in 40 years. And the absolute peak of that drought was Q1 and Q2 FY23. And so what we saw, this is about kind of 18 months or 2 years after we started the intervention. And what we saw was that the average value of sales by our partners, they plateaued during the peak of the drought, as you can see there, but they didn't fall. And once the rains came again in April 2023, the purchases rebounded very strongly. So we see this as an example of good, strong business continuity. And I'm going to go to the next slide, please. So the final word here is just in the last part of the theory of change. We measure resilience capacities and use of capacities. We also measure the impact of our interventions on income and food security. But what we don't do is look at the impact on resilience outcomes at households. And it's really large studies like the large Tango study from Ethiopia that are needed to do that. So I'll leave it there and I'll pass to my colleague, friend, John in Nigeria. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Will, for passing it over to me, and good afternoon, good morning, wherever your time zone is. My name is John Rajkara. I will be presenting some of the evidence from the rural resilience activity, an activity which is implemented by Mercy Corps, funded by USAID in the northeast of Nigeria. Next slide, please. Just to give you a little bit of the context where we work, if you see the map at the corner, at the top corner of your screen, that is the map of Nigeria, and the blue states is where the rural resilience activity is working. This is an area that has been affected by multiple shocks and conflict. And all of this working together has actually disrupted the supply chains, weakened social network between the various market actors, lowered trust of the people, as well as the ability to cooperate amongst themselves. And at the heat of conflict, many market actors left the region, fragmenting the trade in the area. And those who actually rely on agriculture as a means of livelihood also cannot access agricultural inputs, etc. All of these factors working together has limited the economic opportunities and also increased significantly the vulnerability of the people in the region. The rural resilience activity therefore works in this kind of context, and we do facilitate and also protect economic recovery of the people and businesses in this conflict-affected market. We do this by building resilience capacities of people, of households, of institutions, businesses, and also of the markets. As an activity, we focus on several things. Top among them is increasing production and productivity, increasing income, as well as improving the nutrition outcomes. Next slide, please. And the question then comes, how do we build resilience capacity? There are several ways we're doing that, but one notable one is where we leverage commercial agents. Now, commercial agent is not so new in development. There are several projects around the world that have used the commercial agent, where companies serve their customers by introducing agents in between, and these agents are not necessarily on the payroll of these companies, but they're paid based on the commission, based on the kind of service that they do offer to the customers. And we have applied this across several sectors, whether it's on the clean energy or fast-moving consumer goods or access to agricultural inputs. Even as people try to trade with some of these companies, they use the commercial agent. So these are some of the areas that we actually have tried. And we found that it has been very effective, really working in in the Northeast Nigeria. It has helped companies and households also manage the cost. Companies that want to expand into the Northeast have been able to manage their costs. It has also helped them to reduce the risk of investing in a conflict-affected market like Northeast Nigeria. There are instances where commercial agent models have really played a central role in expanding the last half mile, services to the customers. And most importantly, it has also improved the level of trust and cooperation and relationships between the various market actors. Next slide, please. What is critical here is that there is value that is created and also shared between the companies and the households that are either supplying them or also, accessing goods that they require as customers. I'll just give you two examples of Ajia and Aisha from northeast of Nigeria. Ajia was originally an IDP. Like the problems that IDPs go through, she virtually lost everything. In the heat of war, she lost everything. To this day, Ajia partnered with one of the largest seed companies here in Nigeria, and she's not necessarily an employee, but she's working as a commercial agent, selling seeds of this company, getting inventory from this seed company and selling into the IDP communities in which she finds herself. Not only is she earning income, she has actually said that her income has actually grown by 300%. And she's able to take care of her family. Kristen said resilience at household level means improving the well-being of the person. Ideally, not ideally, but in practice, this lady, together with her household, really registering an improvement in their well-being. Another one is Aisha. Aisha also is a lady in Northeast Nigeria. And if you know the context of Northeast Nigeria, a very patriarchal society, also with very strong traditions, Aisha had not found herself contributing to the household well-being beyond really playing a role of a good mother, good wife. But today, Aisha finds herself as an agent, also trading a partner of a very large manufacturer of fast-moving consumer goods, where she gets inventory from them and sell this inventory to our community. She's able to contribute meaningfully to the household income, and she is going beyond her traditional role as a wife and a mother, but now she is also seen as somebody in a household, and she has a voice and her agency really reinforced as a result of working as a commercial agent of a supplier of a large company. Next slide, please. So these two ladies and the two companies I'm talking about are not isolated cases. Today, there are 50 companies that are in partnership with the rural resilience activity, and all of them are actually driving or expanding the boundaries of commercial agent. And like Aisha and Ajia, there are 12,000 others working also as agents of different companies. What we have seen when it comes to market resilience is that our data shows that the turnover over a period of 2 years of using the commercial agent, today we have about $40 million of goods and services being exchanged. When it comes to really also looking at what changes this has created, we're seeing changes at about 2 levels. The first one is a structural change, where we're seeing there's complete increased connectivity among the various market actors. We're also seeing the diversity of market actors increasing their appetite to adopting the commercial agent model. There's also a change in power dynamics, where companies are actually losing power and the agents themselves are gaining power. So you find one agent is probably cross-selling with other companies, and that increases power dynamics at the agent level. And companies that even large companies are happy to sit and negotiate and talk with the agents across the Northeast Nigeria. When it comes to behavioral changes, we are seeing good competition and good collaboration as well happening among the various market actors. This is driven by value that is being created, but also an improvement that is actually happening across the entire system. At household level, we have seen that more than 3 million people are now buying from and also selling to the markets that they desire through the commercial agents that are spread across the northeast of Nigeria. Households that are also accessing these goods and services are noticing that in terms of what they need, that access actually has increased. And because the agents are closer to them, it has helped them to increase their own capacities to manage their risk. And those who actually require some of these goods and services have reported increase in productivity and also growth of incomes at household level. Generally, there is improvement in the well-being of households as a result of the commercial agent model. As an activity, we really believe that market systems or really having functional markets are very essential when it comes to building the resilience of households and also of the communities. Thank you. I will stop here and I'll pass it over to you, Dan and Barka.
Thank you very much, John. Hi, everyone. This is Dan Hudner, the Senior Researcher for Markets and Resilience with Mercy Corps, and I'll be walking us through the question and answer period today. Starting maybe with a bigger one. This is for Mike and Margie at Vicara, and then Kristen, I'll turn it over to you as well, if you don't mind afterwards. We've talked about the resilience of markets and focusing on market systems resilience in general. And then we've also talked about the importance of resilience through markets. So using markets as a vehicle to promote the resilience and recovery of households and communities. And I think Kristen had referenced that 80% of humanitarian aid is now delivered through markets, and that greatly increases sort of the reach and scale that's allowable for development actors. Do you feel that we need to prioritize between the resilience of markets and resilience through markets? You know, should each program or each activity be choosing one as its goal and its North Star? Or how do you feel that we can balance between these two thought processes or uses of systems resilience?
Such a good differentiation between resilience of markets and resilience through markets. And I think it is a different type of interventions when you're looking at understanding how resilient a market is and making it more resilient, and then also understanding how markets can actually help to make households and communities more resilient. And several of the tools that we spoke about in the beginning are looking at what is the function that markets play in making in supporting households and communities to be more resilient. And obviously they can do that more the more resilient the actual market is. But maybe over to Mike for some thoughts.
Sure, thanks. And it is a really interesting question. I think to some extent they're both are required, meaning that, and it's very context specific, meaning that in a specific context, you often have to figure out what is the near, medium, and longer term strategy through which risks are going to be managed. So it's very difficult to think about moving a market or the market itself without actually understanding that there could be very important players in the market that need to have certain services, certain things be reliable to them. So in some ways, what we're learning is that the nature and the context through which large parts of the society manage risk is quite central to the longer term ability of any market to survive and be resilient. So, but it's also is central to understand the context through which people engage market and market systems for their own purposes. We're finding that in a lot of cases, it's hard to assume that very poor communities or communities that are kind of struggling with substantial climate change or other things are going to be able to take on huge market risks, even though they may be reliant on certain elements of the market. So again, one of the challenges is understanding the near, medium, and longer term kind of pathway to improving the overall ability of markets to be resilient, but also the overall ability of markets to be transformational for some of these communities so that they can generate new and more robust kind of mechanisms, such as substantial wealth that would allow them to deal with some of the risks a little bit better.
Yeah, I think all of that is great. And I was going to say the same, like, I think you ultimately need both because these are very interconnected things. And I don't know how you fully parse one from the other in any circumstance. That said, I think your donor has a responsibility to help elevate, which is the goal this specific activity is supposed to focus on. We are the ones that should be looking across our portfolio and determining who really needs to focus on what, because the scope of an activity may allow for both. If it's, you're really looking at one specific thing, you might be able to engage on both ends. But if you have a much broader scope across the market system, getting at that household individual piece might be a bit much, right? So there might need to be another activity that bears the responsibility for that you work in collaboration with. So again, I think the responsibility for that should be borne by your donor. However, if they have abdicated that, I think everything Mike and Margie had said holds true. But, and of course, there are different tools and considerations and questions that you should be asking as an activity, depending which of these things you are looking at. And in a resilience focused context, that you very much need both, and very much both should be on the agenda. However, I would put out there, I would love to see every market systems development program wherever in a non-resilience focused context should be looking at risk and should be integrating this. So, again, to Mike's point, context matters, but considering both is important.
Thank you, Margie and Mike, and thank you, Kristen. I think that's an excellent way of framing the donor's role in setting these goals as well. And I'll point out just from my own experience, I know there's a lot of discussion about what market systems resilience adds to market systems development, or MSD. And I think a lot of MSD practitioners look and say, any MSD framework should account for risk and should account for these types of vulnerabilities. And where I've seen the discussion moving on my side is often, in theory, that's true, but actually implementing good MSD or market systems development reliably and regularly is quite difficult. And I think MSR can serve this, market systems resilience can serve this valuable role as sort of, another reminder or another way to layer in the assessment of risk and vulnerability. So next, for both John and Will, John, I'll ask you to answer first, if that's all right. I think one of the hesitancies around using market systems development and markets-based approaches to build resilience is that markets are not inherently pro-social, and there's not always a clear incentive for them to really engage with more remote or marginalized communities and individuals. And I think you both touched on that a bit in your presentations. And I was wondering if you could speak about how much of a constraint you have seen that to be in your work, and particularly what sorts of incentives or approaches can help get the market actors to really invest in, I think as you phrased it, these trusted relationships up and down the value chain that will be robust and sustainable during shocks and stresses. So John, over to you.
Okay, Dan. I think those challenges are really, there. And if you pick a situation where, shocks such as conflict tend to, change even the good guys into bad guys, then the critical role that we do have to play is always to try to attack those behaviors and change them. Because without addressing some of those fundamentals, then we're likely to just widen the gap and even create more issues. From what we have done is that we have always been very intentional about targeting particular behaviors, those behaviors that tend to exclude or even increase the challenges that we're trying to deal with. That is one. The second thing is where I will borrow from the words of Bill Grant, who actually said, if we look at market systems development, we need to remember from the foundation of making markets work for the poor. And the question is, where are the poor? And in this case, where are the marginalized groups in a market system, and how do we make the system work really for them? And lastly, I would also, pick from Elliot, who has consistently said, I will say it again, that market systems are a necessary condition for a meaningful economic resilience. And I think this is exactly speaking to the heart of where we are in the northeast of Nigeria. We really focus on economic resilience of the people, because the driver or the problem is felt really there. All the other things like the social resilience, etc., are extremely important. But where there is commercial relationship between the various market players, you see that there is sustainability. You see that there is a continuity in doing business. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I think John covered well, how we can build market systems to reach those marginal areas through commercial incentives. I think probably the harder part is, even when you do build those last mile services, how are you making sure you reach the most vulnerable households, even within those areas? And my perspective is that you can't build household resilience without building sustainable systems. And you can't, and the correct methodology for building sustainable systems is MSD. But it's true that we need to adapt our MSD approaches and tactics to give those poorer households the ability to access these new market opportunities, because they're more risk averse. They have less money, they're less willing to try new approaches. Then we can bring in approaches like smart subsidies or even vouchers, so that targeting the poorest households, so they're able to purchase those improved seed varieties or animal feed, so they learn the benefit and they see the value of that. And then I would also just add that MSD is probably not the answer on its own in every kind of context. And so this is where you come to the combination of MSD as a pull, but recognizing still the value of push approaches, ideally through a different program, so you're not confusing participants by mixing two approaches. But I think there is still value in the push approach, things like VSLAs, even like targeted training, like digital literacy training for some communities. Thank you.
That's terrific. Thank you, Will and John. And actually, I'll ask you a quick follow-up, starting this time with Will and then on to John. So both of your contexts, I think, have faced very severe disruptions over the previous several years. I mean, Ethiopia is coming out of one of its worst droughts in decades. Northeast Nigeria, likewise, has continued to experience a variety of both climate, conflict, and macroeconomic shocks. And I believe both of your programs have incorporated both some elements of push, or sort of more household and resilience, household and community-based capacity development, and then also more direct assistance or humanitarian aid to to actually help households as well as businesses cope with these shocks and continue functioning. And could you just speak briefly about how you're set up primarily as systems-oriented or systems-based activities has interacted with your delivery of direct assistance? I mean, Will, you referenced that there can be a negative there and there can be confusion, but it might also create new opportunities. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, sure. And as soon as this drought kind of hit, we were under huge pressure to respond from the government. If we didn't do some response, we were seen as not relevant for the communities we're trying to serve. And the key here is that whatever approach you take, I mean, the minimum is that you're not undermining the markets that you're trying to build. But actually, we saw these huge opportunities to really kind of find new market expansion and new types of products and demand for new types of products. So just to give a couple of examples, one of them was commercial destocking. So incentivizing through small subsidies, livestock's offtake really before the onset, the peak of the drought. And that ended up stimulating these new connections between large buyers and regional traders, and also new practices like provision of credit, and also fodder supply from highland areas to the lowland areas. And some of those have continued. And then the other example, I think, is in our far region, there was basically no demand for concentrated feed. There was no supply and no demand. Everyone said you won't be able to build the markets. We were trying to do that through a partner who was based outside the real region, building last mile supply chains in Afar. And the drought and the e-vouchers we did was a huge stimulus for demand and recognition of the value. And even after the drought has ended, instead of sales falling, they've actually continued to increase. So there is an opportunity there of like building new markets and for new types of products during crisis. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Dan, for that question. Now, in Northeast Nigeria, we have, already issues that tend to make any little shock that really have a very large impact. And just speaking particularly when COVID hit, the markets were, the activity was these first 2 years, the private sector was beginning to set foot, trying to understand new ones, trying to, move into the marketplace. But when COVID came, people were unable to purchase anything. There was lockdown, there was everything that really, pushed back on any gains. And so we went back to USAID based on the data that came out of our assessment. We said, look, the market could potentially, begin to take root, and we think we need to do something, to this marketplace. And if you give us some money that we could actually give out there as non-conditional cash, basically to stimulate economic activity, and then the private sector players would really look at some of these, improvement in purchasing power, and then they react to it. And thanks to USAID, we got some money distributed. Almost $15 million into community household directly to the communities, and then that really boosted their purchasing power. And that became a hook for the private sector players, whether they were dealing in agricultural imports or fast-moving consumer goods, and they were beginning to see that, oh, this place is not as bad as we thought. And so some of them set up, the banking sector set up, agent network, and they were opening accounts, etc. And that became a good point for triggering a transaction in the marketplace. Now, from the operational side of it, at the implementation level, we were also keen that applying or approaching this kind of situation this way might be very distortionary for the kind of work that we do. So we set up like 2 teams. One team was focused on the long game of applying systems lens, and the other team would move in quickly with the cash, give it in and get out. And then that internally would not mess up with our identity. So people were still looking at us as those who are, are concerned with solving immediate problem, like Mike said, also having a long-term lens. And so operationally, that did not challenge the kind of work that we do. But of course, we also collaborated a lot with the other development actors in this space, trying to harmonize how this messaging about the cash would go and how to identify the cash recipients, etc., etc. That played a very strong complementary role in the kind of work that we do. Let me pause here and give the mic back to you.
That's terrific. Thank you, John, and thank you, Will. So really emphasizing that there may be some operational challenges or almost caveats that need to be taken into account, particularly around kind of mixing systems development with direct assistance, but that it can be this really almost exciting stimulus or nudge for building some of the connections that you would want to build regardless of the direct assistance component anyway. And then, and sorry, also, I'll note we're getting a lot of excellent questions. We're not going to be able to address all of them, so hopefully we can answer some in writing or follow up afterwards. Turning back to Vicara, and I think particularly to your experience, Margie, you've seen a lot of different programs and maybe see this from more of a strategic lens or a global lens than most of us that are looking at individual activities. What types of ways have you seen activities work together or cooperate to build market systems resilience, and what works in that regard?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And Mike and I are actually sitting both in different hotel rooms in Ethiopia right now because we're busy working with USAID's Ethiopia Resilience Learning Activity. And we've actually just spent this last week working with up to 10 implementing partners, looking at how can we forge greater cooperation between implementing partner activities around market systems, and particularly market systems work. And this community of practice that we've formed that is looking specifically like that is targeting a specific part, actually the Somali region in Ethiopia. And part of what the implementers have identified and are going to actually be working on very practical ways are things such as obviously sharing sharing resources around assessments that have been done, reviews that have been done, information that gets handed over from one program to the other. They've also formed subgroups where we're looking at what are different market functions that implementing partners can coordinate around. So at the moment, they're looking, for example, at the seed system and how can different programs that are working at very different levels of the seed system share what they're doing, share the activities, what is in their work plan, and also what are their approaches, and how are they able to take more of a market systems lens so that they're actually bringing more of a systems lens no matter where they're working. If they're even working at kind of more humanitarian context through their development context, how do they start supporting the different approaches? And they're looking at, for example, the retail sector, whether they're in wash activities or in input supplier for seedlings and seeds and other equipment, whatever it might be. They're looking at aggregation activities and sort of the buying space and finance. So a lot of really interesting things coming out of that space.
Okay, thank you, Margie. That's terrific. And I think a good reminder that understanding the system you're working in, even if you're not trying to engage with all of the parts, is really critical, not only for the individual activity or program, but also for kind of broader strategic cooperation. Now, on that note, I know systems thinking I don't know our exact makeup of participants. To many, that may be very familiar, but to others, that may sound, complex, mysterious, or quite challenging to engage with. So Mike, I'll ask you where you've seen, both from your own experience, but also through the recent Market Systems Symposium held in Cape Town this month, actually, and then the Resilience Evidence Forum, likewise held in Cape Town in June. You've seen a lot of different programs that are largely market systems development and to some extent incorporating a resilience lens. What do you see as some of the common success factors or likewise challenges or pitfalls that programs can run into?
I have an interesting question in that I kind of going back to what Kristen said, I cannot really imagine doing an MSD program without having some kind of MSR lens in it to understand how risk is managed. And even some of the questions you had to Will, it was related to this idea of behaviors and sometimes bad behaviors in market actors. Through the MSR lens, you can often see what is the driving rationale for why they would have bad behaviors, why they would engage in price fixing or adulteration or things like that. You can get a better sense of why they may do that or think that is a rational market activity when you apply an MSR lens, which becomes important because what you're trying to do then is figure out what would be the positive alternative to get them to stop doing it. The behavior change that makes it useful for them, because they're not going to do something because I just tell them it's not good. They're only going to do something because they think it's useful for them. And an MSR gives us huge insights into why we could come up with alternatives that would be interesting to them. In that sense, what I think is interesting is even MSD approaches seem to be evolving quickly related to this new set of insights of how risk is kind of applied or how risk is managed in different contexts. It's also giving a lot of insights into changing ways communities engage markets, like some of the interesting stuff we listened from Will before, but some are from our Kenya study and some of the stuff we learned from Ethiopia study ourselves, was that in some of the pastors' communities, the kind of onset of climate change, population changes, is forcing them to make different coping strategies or test new coping strategies out. And you don't necessarily see that opportunity from just a pure MSD lens. One example Will had that was really interesting to me was he started to see goats, the sale of goats get younger and younger, which is what the market really wanted. But historically, they would only sell the old or dying goats because they particularly were using them as a saving instrument. But now as they're using them as an income generating mechanism, it's a very different strategy that then you can see how a market actor would engage them much differently than if they were just selling the older and sicker goats. And you can see that kind of only through an MSR lens, but it's hugely helpful for an MSD project because you can see where opportunities are emerging when they weren't there before.
Okay, thank you, Mike. That's terrific. And yeah, I think really just emphasizing, again, when we talk about the system, a lot of what that means is understanding the behavior of actors at each different level, their incentives, their motivations, as well as how, risks, shocks, and stresses, particularly climate change being perhaps one of the largest ones that we're all experiencing, are changing their incentives as things move forward. So I think we've got time for just one last question, and I'm going to open this up to each of the panelists actually. So Will, I'll start with you, and then turn over to John, and then to Vikara, Mike or Margie, up to you. Thinking back again, this is a lot that we are bringing forward, and some programs are, engaged with all elements here, and others are really just beginning to try to either add in this resilience or risk lens to MSD. Others are, have been thinking about resilience and risks, but haven't thought about the system side in great depth. So Will, if you could offer advice to programs on one tactic or process that's been most useful in bringing this market systems resilience lens into your programming, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so I think what was key for us was simplifying and kind of demystifying MSR and applying it in a really practical way. Definitely using the kind of USAID MSR framework. That's great in terms of guiding on kind of how you should be thinking about it, but not reinventing the wheel. For those of you in the audience who are market systems development practitioners, it's really about adapting existing tools to make sure you're asking the right questions around what happens during shocks and around some of these resilience capacities of businesses as well as of households. And I kind of think of it as like in the same way that when we try and make sure we're not missing gender, we just integrate gender into each tool in the MSD process. For me, MSR is exactly the same. We don't need to do anything too extra. We just integrate those questions, and it becomes quite logical for the team when they start thinking about it in practice.
Okay, terrific. Short and simple. John, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. I agree very much with what Will has said, that even as we become more intentional about this, it becomes very natural. Like Anna put in the chat, that from a few years from now, we'll probably be not talking about market systems development and market systems resilience, as two different things. Now, for many people who have tried to, become inclusive, develop inclusive development. A few years ago, you almost needed to think of separate interventions that will drive inclusivity. To this day, we're seeing that infused organically. On our end, I think also one thing that has worked for us was, especially when it comes to partnership selection, we learned a lot that those partnerships with the local partnerships in married to a particular context. Those that have a stake in the local economy are probably have like the best, those are like your best bets. So yes, they may have issues of capacities, etc. But I think that is why we actually are here as facilitators, is to try to build that, even as we find ways of working with them in order to drive the market systems resilience. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, John. So touching on localization, which we've perhaps left out a little more than we should have. And then Mike, turning it over to you, if you have one piece of advice on where to begin incorporating the resilience lens.
Yeah, John and Will stole most of my ideas, but I'll try and cover something else. The one thing I would add to both of what they said is the importance of taking a learning strategy from the beginning. And MSR and these frameworks and doing analysis is helpful as a starting point, but the communities we work with, the societies we work with, the market systems we work with are very complex, and they're also dynamic. So even when we know stuff, it may be old by the time we can actually use it. So taking a really strong learning approach to this is really quite central. And I think, as John and Will said, you have to kind of integrate these new lenses as opposed to thinking of them separate.
Okay, so including learning, adaptive management throughout your program as well as the shocks change. And Kristen, I think we're at time, but the donor privilege perhaps gives you a one-sentence response to the answer or to the question, if you can. Over to you.
I've got it. Anytime you're going to ask a question about profit or growth, pair it with a question about risk. That's simple.
Perfect. Okay, so just to recap, we've got one, really just getting started and kind of beginning wherever you are to incorporate the resilience lens, building in the strong localization element, building in a strong learning focus and adaptive management, and then asking about risk, just always keeping that in the back of your mind. So with that, we're at time. So thank you again to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you for all the excellent questions, and we'll be answering more of those in the chat and as we share out an email with all of the resources that we've referenced today. Thank you also to both my co-host, Barka, the resilience advisor from the Rural Resilience Activity. And then thank you to the rest of the panelists. So from the Vicara Institute, we have Mike Field and Margie Brand. From the Feed the Future Rural Resilience Activity in Nigeria, John Rashkara, Chief of Party. And then the RIPA North, the Resilience and Pastoralist Areas North in Ethiopia. We have likewise the Chief of Party, Will Barron, and then Kristen O'Planek from USAID. So just to very quickly summarize, I think we've kind of covered that you can't really differentiate between the systems lens and the household lens. You can't really talk about resilience of one without resilience of the other. There's a strong benefit to including the systems lens anytime that we're going to be analyzing even just household resilience and ways for us to engage and develop it. And by including that systems lens and continuous learning approach, you're going to be recognizing how shocks and stresses are continuing to impact the motivations and the behavior of each of these elements, whether that's household behavior around selling goats, whether that's the incentives of market actors to really be continuing to engage with, particularly remote or marginalized communities, and just continuing to try to understand that is really critical. One of the things that I can say personally, we've seen coming out of a recent workshop that was funded by USAID's Resilience Evaluation Analysis and Learning Award, or the REAL Award, was the importance of just beginning. There's not really one, correct, perfect way to get started, but just beginning to incorporate this risk or resilience lens and start to look at the system dynamics that way is really critical. You never need another qualification. You don't really need to bring on an expert for it. You can just get started as long as you're prepared to learn as you go. I'll note also one piece that we'll be getting to that I think the global community is moving towards is not only evidence around how to incorporate the resilience lens into market systems development, but more and more evidence on what works. And if we recognize that there's a need to build stronger connectivity or greater inclusion, or even build more competition, how we can best achieve that. And I think that's an area that over the next couple of years, I'm very excited to kind of see what comes out of that. And then the last note, again, we'll be sharing a variety of resources that includes all of the links that we shared here. It also includes a lot of the summaries that are coming out of the Market Systems Symposium that was held earlier this month, as well as the Resilience Evidence Forum that really touched on the importance of using a market lens or using markets as a source of support and resilience for households. So thank you again for joining, everyone. We really appreciate it.